And welcome back. Today we are going to talk about some watercolor techniques. We are going to do the wet on dry, wet on wet, a wash, a wet on a wash, and a two-color blend. Now the way this works is each of these is a little bit about how the brush and the paint are in reaction to what is on the page. So I'm going to work the brush around here in some of my orange paint and get the brush loaded. This is a cake style watercolor, so it's a very high concentrate, and you just got to work around to get the wetness in there. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm going to put some paint down on this to try to get this to where it can dry, so we can hopefully get to it here in a little bit. But we're going to get this loaded up more, and watercolor works where you need just that. You need water. So I'm going to work the paint around in this a little bit. Now what we use in class, we have some of these. We also have some what we call a semi-moist, where there is a little bit of moisture in them, where it doesn't take nearly as much water to get things working. This is just some cheap dollar store stuff that I had on hand to demonstrate with here in my home studio. So wet on dry. Our paper is dry. So we're going to take a wet brush, and we're going to just kind of see what kind of marks we can get with our brush. I'm using a number 6 brush, which is pretty big for this. But you can kind of see how if I use just the very point of it, I can get a really thin line, and then get some pressure on it, and it goes thick. You can see how that goes pretty far. Now if I come over here and I grab my flat brush and work some of this on here, I can get some different types of marks. I can get a mark that is very thin and precise. I can go to little marks. So if you had like a little tree that you wanted to do or something like that, you can do that. Or you can go from a thin line to a thick, back to a thin, fairly easy. Now the next one is a wet on dry. So, or wet on wet, excuse me. So what that means is you have a page that has some water on it, whether it be just clean water. Ideally, I didn't get that clean enough, but you can see how there is some moisture on that page. Okay, and we'll put a little bit more on there. Now we can see what's going to happen when I come back in here with a loaded brush. Because this paper is wet, I'm going to put my brush down. You can see how it runs, and it gives me a fuzzy line, whereas over here on the dry it gives me a nice clean line. So if I go from dry to wet back to dry, you can see how that fuzzes out. So if you're going to blend some colors together, like in a sky, something like that, the wet on wet technique is what you want to use, because those colors are going to bleed together, because the osmosis of the water is going to help the color move. Now the next thing we're going to do here is a wash. And with a wash, it is where you try to get a nice flat, even, consistent color, which is what you're going to do with, say, when you're filling in a silhouette. You want to try to get that nice and even like that. Okay, so we're going to let this dry for a little bit more. We're going to skip down here to the two-color blend. Okay, we'll come back to the wet on wash. So I'm going to get this wet, and I'm going to put some orange down. And I'm going to take my other brush, and I'm going to come in here into this green. Now generally, orange and green are fairly opposite each other on the color wheel. They're not exact complements, but they're really close to it. So I'm going to get some green down here. You can see nice dark color, and we're going to get this to try to blend in with the orange. Now sometimes, a lot of times, when you get colors that are opposite each other, they will kind of go muddy. So I'm just going to get a little bit of water on the brush, just clean water. Try to get these things to blend. Sometimes these work really well, sometimes not so much. Colors that are close to each other on the color wheel in the same color family, they blend really well. So this blended okay, we'll say. Now, the wet on a wash. It's not quite dry. That's okay though. That'll actually work in our favor. So we can see how this green is going to give us a nice, you can see how it's a nice solid color here. Now, when I put this over the orange, you can see how the color changes a little bit. Because watercolors by nature are a little bit transparent to where you can see through them. So the color that is underneath is going to affect the color that you put on top of it. So they're not necessarily going to blend, because ideally this is dry, but it will affect the way the color looks. All right, so that is what you're going to do for this project. You've got wet on dry, wet brush on dry paper. You got wet on wet. You got wet brush on wet paper. You have a wash, which is just a solid flat color. You have a wet on a wash, which is doing wet paint over a wash. That's a solid color. And then you're blending two colors together just to try to get a nice even transition. All right, so let's go paint.